समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
If you've been to a Uniqlo store lately, Uniqlo now has a series of stores in many big cities of India, and chances are many of you have been there. If you do, as you look left and right at the entrance, usually you will find a lot of very nice looking t-shirts displayed. T-shirts like these, in fact, I bought a couple just the other day and I bought them for a reason. Now, if you see these t-shirts, when I saw these t-shirts, my first impression was, my first presumption was that these t-shirts, because Uniqlo made a promise to source quite a bit of the stuff that they sell in India, from India, made in India, I thought at least this stuff should be made in India because India is supposed to be such a power, such a global power in textiles and garments, particularly cotton textiles and garments. And India also has such a humongous hosiery industry, right? However, when I picked this up, very nice t-shirts, I was surprised to see where these are made. Can you guess where these are made? They are made in a country called Vietnam. A country called Vietnam, 10 crore population, 331,000 square kilometers area, so a little smaller than Rajasthan, a little bigger than Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh, right? That country with 10 crore people is producing this stuff at such efficiency and at such prices that even in India, it's worthwhile, it's better economic sense to import this from Vietnam and sell it here instead of what is made in India, right? Why do I tell you this story? This is not about trade or anything. This is about, I'm just using this story as a way of getting into the story on Vietnam, the most interesting country to India's east. Now that's a country a lot of Indians go to. It's a big magnet for Indian tourists, and that is the complaint, say in Goa and many other Indian tourist hotspots, that people are now going to Vietnam. There are multiple flights going straight to Vietnam from India, connecting to Vietnam from India, and Indian tourists who are going there are very happy, and they come back with these very impressed stories of great infrastructure, cleanliness, discipline, law and order. Importantly, Vietnam has another story. And that another story, I will go into how Vietnam has become a big exporting power, and I'll give you some data. But important thing is, Vietnam also has launched a massive scaling down of its government. While we are talking about DOGE and Elon Musk and Donald Trump, they are talking and they are laying off some people. Vietnam, I am recording this on Wednesday evening. On Tuesday, Vietnam time, Vietnam, as you know, is ahead of us. So less than 24 hours before I started recording this, Vietnamese parliament, by a 97% majority. Now, of course, it's a Marxist-Leninist country, it's a communist dictatorship, so I'd like to know who the 3% who did not vote in favor of this are, because I wish them well, right? But the fact is that 97% voted in their national parliament for a change in the law and in the system, whereby 20%, that is 1 in 5, 20% of all government employees or civil servants will be laid off. When will this come into effect? This comes into effect not in the next 5-year plan, not in the next financial year. This comes into effect March 1. That is within about a week from now. That is how fast they have moved. And what all does it do? First of all, it lays off 20% of the civil servants or central government or federal government employees there, which is about 100,000, about a lakh of people. A lakh of people being laid off from government service over a population base of 10 crores is a bit like in a country like India, about 15 lakh people being laid off. So Think about it. 15 lakh government employees being laid off. Think about it. The audacity of this measure. This is when Doge, Elon Musk have just started. Then 5 ministries have been abolished. 5 ministries have been abolished. Some have been merged. A new one has been created. So what used to be 18 ministries has now become 14 ministries, right? For comparison, India has 53 ministries. India has 53 ministries and 90 plus departments, because some ministries have multiple departments and they are ministers of state handling those, but 53 full cabinet ministries in India, right? This was 18, this has now become 14. So To Lam, the leader of Vietnam, the dictator of Vietnam, because in Vietnam, like in China, Vietnam is one of the 2 Marxist-Leninist countries in Southeast Asia, China being the other. It's run purely by a communist party. It's a party state. So the president is also general secretary of the party. So To Lam, who took over last year, he's a fairly recent strongman of Vietnam. He's taken these decisions. Now, there is always politics. And next year is the National Party Congress for the Vietnamese Communist Party. And that's where To Lam is expecting to be elected leader for the next full term. And that is why he's carrying out this reform in the build-up to that term. So usually in politics like ours, when time comes to look at a fresh term, you actually start doing populist things and not take tough decisions. In this case, tough decisions are taken. I know. Your response will be, it's a dictatorship, so you will expect him to do it. But there are many dictatorships where no such thing is done. In fact, dictators take recourse to populism even more than democratic leaders. That said, look at what's happening in Vietnam. Now in December, To Lam had made his intentions clear. He said, and I quote from him in his speech, "Sometimes we have to take the bitter medicine, endure pain, and cut out the tumors in order to have a healthy and strong body." Donald Trump didn't say it. Elon Musk didn't say it. It didn't happen now. This is not a copycat thing. To Lam said this in December last year. And Parliament also decided that the employees that will be laid off, there will be generous payouts for them. However, there is no guarantee for re-employment or anything like that. Now, this is, I thought, a good opportunity for us to also look at this very interesting country called Vietnam, very friendly with India. India has about a $15 billion trade with them, 9.34 billions of imports, that's last year, exports of 5.47. So India has a nearly $4 billion trade deficit with Vietnam as well. Now, what is Vietnam? Vietnam, we know the history, we know it fought the American power, before that it fought the French power, became independent. Vietnam War ended in 1975. 1976, the country had its reunification. North and the South came together and Communist Party took over. In early 1980s, following the Chinese example, early 1980s, Vietnam began to change and started adopting free market policies. By late 80s or beginning of 90s, it was fully into the Deng Xiaoping mode. It had fully adopted the free market policies. And the Western world helped, the Americans helped. Americans have this history. A country goes to war with them. There are jokes about this, but I'm saying it seriously because this has happened. Germany, Japan, countries that have gone to war with America, lost the war, got devastated. Americans have then spent the next few decades helping those countries rebuild. In some cases with direct help, say Marshall Plan in Europe. In some cases in more modern times by using the instrument of trade, etc. So a lot of the manufacturing shifted to Vietnam, particularly out of China. There's been a lot of talk about China+1. If there was a concept like that, China+1, that has already come to pass. That has already taken place. That +1 in this case is Vietnam. So a lot of the manufacture is shifted there. Vietnam has become an incredible export house now. How big an export house it is? Vietnam's GDP right now, this year, is projected to be close to $500 billion. It was 465 billion last year. Maybe it'll be $500 billion this year because the country is growing at about 7%. The country is growing at about 7%, although To Lam is targeting 8% going ahead. But if it grows even at 6%, it will come to about $500 billion. Country's total GDP was about $465 or $460 billion. The country's exports were about $430 billion, depending on where you apply the cutoff, right? But about that much. So if you just want to see exports as a percentage of GDP of Vietnam, exports accounted for 93.8% of the GDP of Vietnam. The imports were also high, 89.98. That's because a lot of the things Vietnam makes, it first imports parts from outside. If you look at Vietnam's exports, and you will see some data and some charts as we go along, you will find that Vietnam's largest export is what is called as broadcasting equipment. Broadcasting equipment is a very wide range. It's radio, TV, cameras, transmission equipment, phones, transmission apparatus for radio, stuff like that, a lot of the electronic stuff for which they will import parts and stuff either from America or from China or Japan and put it together. That's the reason they become the assembling or manufacturing hub. Vietnam, but manufacturing as a percentage of Vietnam's GDP is about 1.5 times as high as in the case of India. A lot of that is then consumed in exports. So this is truly an export powerhouse. Again, look at this comparison. If you look at the ranking of countries by way of export surplus with America, you will see at number 1, obviously China, at number 2, Mexico, then European Union, if you see them as 1, and then it's Vietnam. Last year, Vietnam's trade surplus with America was $123 billion. That's about 3 times of India's trade surplus with America, and see how much trouble is Trump giving to India, threatening to raise tariffs, etc. Let us see what he does to Vietnam. Because Vietnam imports almost nothing from America. It exports a lot to America, as shows in its trade surplus, but it imports less than $10 billion worth from America. And what it exports is really the kind of stuff normally a big colonial power or imperial power or a big, huge dominant economy, high-tech economy will import from a third world country. So it imports soybean, cotton, other agricultural stuff and things like that. So this is truly a export manufacturing giant, with exports being equal to 93.8, you can say 94% of the country's GDP. You want to understand this? I will give you some comparisons. The comparison with India, exports are 21.89%, equivalent of India's GDP. Imports are 23.96. Now, when your imports are higher than exports, obviously you have a trade deficit and a current account deficit. Not too bad, but there is a deficit. 21.89 exports as a percentage of GDP, 23.96 imports. In the case of Vietnam, 93.8% exports, 89.98% imports. So you can see there is a surplus of more than 3% of GDP. The US, it's a big, huge economy and big, huge GDP. Their exports are 11.6% of the GDP, but remember that GDP is a humongous one. Imports are 15.41%, which means America's current account deficit and America's trade deficit is much, much larger as a percentage of GDP. South Korea, an exporting nation, again 44% of GDP equivalent is the exports, 43.94 is the imports. China, again you want to know, exports are the equivalent of 19.74% of China's GDP, which is a very large GDP of about 4.5 to 5 times as big as India's, and its imports are 17.57. Now what this does is, this leads us to another ratio, and that is the export-import ratio, right? And how does this export-import ratio work? In case of China, for example, it's 1.12. That means for every $100 worth that they import, they export $112 worth. That is a simple way of understanding this. For the US, on the other hand, it is 0.76, which means for every $100 worth that they import, they export only $76 and the rest becomes their deficit. In case of India, it's 0.91, so nowhere near as bad as America, but yet there is a consistent deficit. If we export $91, we import $100. A lot of this is accounted for by oil. Vietnam, on the other hand, has 1.04, right? So for every $100 they import, they export $104, but they do value addition, which means it creates that many jobs in Vietnam. And as we talk, Vietnam now, besides being such a powerhouse of electronics exports, has also become a sizable exporter of textiles and garments. In fact, it has now left Bangladesh behind as the second largest exporter in the world of textile and garment. Evidence of that you can see in Uniqlo stores, that t-shirts made in Vietnam can pay for freight, maybe some tariffs, etc., everything, and yet be more competitive than what is produced in India, maybe in Coimbatore and places like that, which are our hosiery and garment hub. It is this country, this powerhouse, which now says it is undertaking its second round of massive reforms, major reforms and shift after it had adopted market economics in the 80s, and that is downsizing of the government. And To Lam said in his speech that the purpose of this downsizing is not to cut costs, it is to increase or improve efficiencies. That is just what Trump and Elon Musk are saying. So among things that he's abolishing, I told you ministries come from 18 to 14, 4 agencies of the government are abolished, 5 TV channels are also abolished. For example, ministries of planning and investment, they have been merged in the Ministry of Finance. Ministry of Transport and Construction have been combined. Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment have been combined with the Ministry of Agriculture. And I know that as I go on, you will keep on saying, oh, but this is a communist dictatorship. Do you want your country also to be a communist dictatorship? Certainly not. But America is not a Republican or MAGA dictatorship. They are also carrying out a downsizing of their government. They are doing it dramatically because Trump has to appeal to his base and tell them that he's keeping his promises. Vietnam, because it's a one-party dictatorship, they can do it surgically. However, compare this with the situation in our country. We talked about minimum government. On the other hand, just at the time when DOGE is cutting the size of the US government in such a big way, Javier Milei has cut his government into almost half and reaped the benefits from that. Vietnam is doing all this downsizing and cutting of the government, creating a minimum government there. We have announced the formation of the 8th Pay Commission. So we have to see the contrast in the direction in which countries are going. Now, Vietnam, it's not to say that they have no politics. Now, because these ministries were being merged, some key people were losing their jobs. So those had to be accommodated because these are important people. And To Lam does not want them to become dissidents or a problem or to start challenging him or spoiling his chances for re-election and now election for a full term. To Lam is a 4-star general, has the rank of a 4-star general, although he spent all his life in the police forces. In his previous job, that is under his predecessor, he was the head of the group that was fighting corruption. So he was head of the anti-corruption agency in the country. Very powerful man, but knows his politics. So 2 of these people, ministers who were losing their jobs, they've been accommodated. How? They've been accommodated by being kicked upstairs. Both have become deputy prime ministers. So what has gone up in the government is the number of deputy prime ministers. That has gone up from 5 to 7. And what's happened in this case? So Minister Nguyen Chi Dung, I hope I pronounced the name right, Nguyen Chi Dung, who was planning and investment minister, his ministry, as you know, has been merged with finance, and also Mai Wan Chin. Mai Wan Chin, a powerful figure in the party, he was the head of Central Committee of Communist Party of Vietnam's Mass Mobilization Commission. Now, Mass Mobilization Commission has been abolished as part of this cost cutting and merged into the propaganda department. These 2 comrades who would have lost their jobs because of the abolition of one's ministry and the other's commission, the party pulpit, they've both been accommodated and made deputy prime ministers. It's not as if even in a dictatorial position or a dictatorial darbar, politics ceases. Politics doesn't cease anywhere. It's also possible that Vietnam is also fast forwarding this change now because they must be concerned as well about Trump's attack with tariffs. Because if Trump has such a humongous trade deficit with them, will Trump make a Vietnam exception? Will he or Elon Musk carry on their conscience the weight of what the Americans did to Vietnam in the past? I'm not quite so sure, and I don't think even the Vietnamese can be so sure. And that's the reason they are trying to make their country and their economy even more efficient. That, by the way, is the competition for India. We have already lost the China+1 race. +1 is Vietnam. We are now next in line, and we have to do what we can to reform our economy, our governance, take out the friction from our system. Otherwise, we could be left far behind, particularly in the manufacturing and export competition.